Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, episode 43, System Setup Tips. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here with UltimateAVMag.com and HomeTheaterMag.com. My guest geek this week is Tom Norton, senior editor of Home Theater Magazine and a recurring guest on the show, who's going to talk with me about basic system setup tips. Very important topic, and I'm really glad to have you on, Tom. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, no problem. It's going to be like home week.
It is. Those who are tuned into the live video stream at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions for us, and I'll pass on as many as I can. But I know we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I know that it's a very important topic that I get asked about all the time, and I'm sure you do too, Tom, huh?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Is how do we get the most out of our home theaters? How do we set it up? How do we tweak things to get the best possible performance and really home theater experience that we can? So I wanted to start with equipment placement. You know, someone buys a new home theater in a box or some new speakers, a new TV. They want to know where to put it. And so let's start with the speakers, because that's always a very important topic, especially with surround sound systems, a 5.1 or 7.1. And there is actually a standard, which I have a picture of, and it's the DSX 91A that we can put up on the screen. And Tom, you can maybe give us a little narrative of this once we get it up there. There it is.
Right.
So the red speakers, this is from the company Odyssey, which gives us an automatic setup routine that we're going to talk about later. But for now, we have the black and white speakers, or the basic ones, and then the red ones are the extra ones. So let's start with just the basic 5.1.
Okay.
So, Tom, why don't you take us through this real briefly?
Okay, well, you show that diagram again, okay, so I can see what I'm talking about here. Your left and right, obviously going to be the left or right of your screen. That's kind of given. But one thing you need to be concerned about that I just popped into my head as you mentioned it is how far apart you put the left and right speakers. It's going to depend on you. I mean, to get for full stereo experience, I normally recommend at least 7 or 8 feet apart. But if you've got a 42-inch TV and speakers 7 or 8 feet apart, there might be what we call a cognitive disconnect between the sound and the picture. The sound is huge, the picture is much smaller. That bothers some people. It doesn't bother others. It doesn't bother me. I live with that sort of setup for several years, but it can be an issue, and it's something you might want to experiment with to find out if you're bothered by an extra wide. But if you're not, bring them in as close as you can, and bring them in a few inches or a foot or two at a time until things seem to lock in without you losing the stereo effect. I mean, if you're sitting 10 feet away from speakers that are 4 feet apart, you're not going to get much stereo effect from them.
Right. So exactly. The basic spec is you want the front, right, and left to be plus or minus 30 degrees away from the center axis. But I think everybody needs to play with that. That depends. That sort of and it sort of imagines an ideal room, if nothing else. Which very few people have.
Yeah, right. And it's that's a good place to start. But I wouldn't say, if you say, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, but I don't dare move it because that's what the book says I should do. Move them. Don't be locked into that.
Exactly.
And then you want your center speaker obviously is going to have to go above or below the screen unless you have a projector with perforated screen, which is a completely other story. So most of the time with flat panel TVs, it's going to wind up in some fashion below the screen. It's certainly in the old CRT days with the big CRTs, you can put it on top of the CRT. There's not much room on top of your TV to balance the center speaker anymore.
Yeah, not on top of these new thin flat panels. That's for sure.
Unless you have a shelf on the wall above the screen, which is a possibility too. So keep that in mind.
Have you found that putting the speaker above or below in general is generally better, or does it really not matter?
Doesn't really matter that much, but it depends. They're going to sound different, and it depends on where. If you get it below the screen, and if it's really close to the floor, it might boost the mid bass and make the voices sound a little bit woofy or barrely. Mm-hmm. It might sound too full-bodied. That probably won't bother you too much. That tends to be a problem with projector systems. I have that issue occasionally because I have my in a projection system. I have my speaker below the screen, and it's only about 18 inches off the floor. Mm-hmm. So some speakers work fine in that position, others don't, and I don't tend to necessarily blame the speaker. If the speaker has a little bit of excess in that area, or it's perfectly flat, it might sound a little bit elevated. If it's slightly reduced in that area to start with, it might sound fine under the screen. Mm-hmm, so mm-hmm. I would experiment first with wherever it seems most logical for you, above or below the screen, as far as your room set up and shelves and everything else are concerned, or where you can put it.
I know that you've got your center below the screen. I've actually got my center above the screen because I happen to have a shelf.
You have a shelf where you can put it above the screen, yeah.
Where you can put it above the screen, and in my case, it's angled down slightly towards the listening position. In your case, it's angled up slightly towards.
Yep. And there's another option too. If you've got your typical center channel, which is we call woofer tweeter woofer or mid tweeter mid tweeter mid MTM, some people call it, which is two woofer mid ranges with a tweeter in the middle. Right. Which, by the way, is the worst kind of center channel speaker. But we can get into that in a bit, but has nothing to do with setup specifically. But in that case, angling it up or down is basically just getting on the optimum axis for the tweeter, because
the high frequencies are more directional than the low frequencies.
But it shouldn't make any other difference. Any other differences with that kind of but with a more ideal type center channel, which I consider a three-way center channel that has a mid range and a tweeter in the middle, one above the other, and two woofers left and right. Mm-hmm. In that case, if you may want to experiment with tilt more so, other than just the high frequency response, because you might get some interference patterns between the vertically mounted mid range and tweeter, and if you got to sit on a specific axis for it to sound its best. So you may find it sounds more different than you expect by tilting the speaker up or down. And that's true of any center channel speaker, but it's worth experimenting with if it's not inconvenient. Just don't tilt it so much it falls off the shelf.
Good idea.
Make sure it's secure.
Yeah. Then let's touch on the surrounds. Yep. And in a 5.1 system, if we can get that same diagram up again real quickly. Again, the book says put the surrounds at around plus or minus 110 degrees, I believe. So they're not directly behind you. They're not directly to the sides. They're a little bit behind you.
A little bit behind you, yeah.
And
go ahead. A lot. It's a good starting point. A lot of that's going to depend on how wide your room is. I found if your room is not particularly wide, and I have this problem in my room. I mean, 15 feet wide doesn't sound that narrow, but it is in the case if you got someone sitting, off to the side, close to the end of the, close to one of the speakers, closer to one of the surrounds than the other. Mm-hmm. If you have your surrounds even at 110 degrees or at 90 degrees at the side, that surround's going to be too obvious to you. Even if you set up the levels correctly, you may find it's too much. So you may wind up having to put them further back.
Right. But, and also another thing about surrounds I've found is that it's generally a good idea to put them up higher than your front speakers, because you want basically a diffuse surround field coming out of those surround speakers, right?
Well, more or less diffuse. It depends on the source. For most movies, yes, I'd say probably most of the time diffuse works best. If you're talking about surround music, maybe not so much. Depends on what type of music you want. If you want real instruments in the back and the front, that type of surround, you don't want it too diffuse because the surround's not going to sound the same as the front. In that case, you're going to have the instruments in front sounding different than the instruments in back.
Right, exactly. So it depends on you're right. It depends on your application whether or not you're going to be watching mostly movies or listening mostly to surround music. Yeah,
I'd set it up for whatever your primary source is going to be, and live with it for the others. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Another thing on that point is for movies, your surround speakers are often what are called bipole or dipole. That is, they have drivers aiming forwards and backwards. And that actually creates a more diffuse surround sound field, which you wouldn't want with surround music, But then again, there are some speakers that let you switch between being a direct, using only one set of those radiators, for example, drivers, and or using both of them and creating that more diffuse effect.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of disagreement as to whether you want that type of speaker for surrounds or just a regular forward radiating conventional speaker in the back. The idea of a diffuse surrounds was really launched about 20 years ago when we had Dolby Surround or Dolby Pro Logic, where the surrounds, there was really only one surround channel. In Dolby Surround or Dolby Pro Logic, and there were no discrete surrounds. So basically, whatever was in the surround, you wanted to diffuse it as much as possible, and to avoid, basically having it locate right in the middle between the two rear surrounds. So you wanted to diffuse surrounds, but and so then they introduced bipole speakers. I mean dipoles, but dipoles and bipoles are different. The dipole speaker is basically it's two sets of drivers, one set facing slightly forward and one set facing slightly backwards. I mean, you may find that you've probably seen them with a kind of a triangular front on them.
Right. Exactly.
And the drivers on both sides are out of phase. So if those drivers are positioned directly to the sides of you, and those would work better to the sides than 110 degrees back, by the way. If those are positioned to the sides of you, you're sitting in what we call the null, between the two out of phase sets of drivers. Right. So you can't actually position the surround, though it will be throwing sound into the room, diffusing it forward and backwards to create a diffuse sound field. But it eliminates to a certain extent the surround screaming into your ear effect. Sort of
Which might be a good thing if you're sitting too close.
If you're sitting too close, but the problem with that is it only works if you're sitting directly abeam the surrounds. If you have two rows of listeners, for instance, in a home theater, and the people in the back or the people in the front of those nulls, they're not going to see that. They're not going to have the same effect.
Right.
So it can be an issue, and that's why some people prefer, bipole, which basically the front and back are in phase. Okay. So there's no null, but it spreads the sound more evenly, so you get a better spread of sound for multiple rows of listeners. And then other people prefer direct radiators because they tend to be more spectrally similar to the fronts.
Right, which is one thing we want to make, I always make very clear, or try to anyway, is you want the tonal characteristics of all of your speakers to be as closely matched as possible, so that when things pan around from one speaker to the next, they don't change their timbral characteristic, which takes you out of the immersion and into, I'm sitting in a theater with a bunch of speakers sitting around me.
Yeah, well, that's the old story is, you've got a car driving across the screen, and it's a Mercedes on the left and right and a Volkswagen in the middle. But that doesn't happen too often. I mean, how often in a movie, even an action movie, you have a pan of a car, maybe it lasts 10 seconds of that during a whole movie.
Right.
So it's not a deal breaker, so to speak. But yeah, you want it to be pretty close. You'll never find an exact timbre match between even identical speakers all around, because the room will keep that from happening.
Right, exactly right. The room is always one of the most important components in your whole system, and one of the most difficult to deal with. We're not going to get too much into that today, because that's a whole other show about acoustics.
That's 20 shows.
Yeah, indeed. So we've covered now 5.1. We're going to get to the subwoofer in a minute. I know we've got some questions in the chat room about that. But before we do, I want to get to, I just want to mention 7.1. The typical 7.1, which is the second or third diagram in the DSX series that I sent up to John, our engineer, shows where the back surround speakers go. Here it is. We have the side surrounds, or 110-degree surrounds, and then we have the back surrounds in a 7.1 system. And interestingly, there is no specification for where to place those back surround speakers. I think you use a 5.1 system in your home, don't you, Tom?
Yes, and most of us at the magazine and you yourself use 5.1 and not 7.1.
That's right. And why would you say that is?
It depends on the room. I mean, if I had a much larger room, I might experiment more with 7.1. But the way my room is right now, I have to put the surrounds more or less further back than that 110 degrees required to get the best spread, and that doesn't leave any space for another pair of speakers, basically. Right.
And then there's the issue of how effective 7.1 really is, because what 7.1 generally means is 3 in the front, left, right, and center, and 4 in the back, 4 surrounds. And as you and I both know, Tom Holman, the TH and THX, advocates that, or points out, I should say, that the human hearing system is not nearly as sensitive to directionality from the back as it is from the front. So why are we putting more speakers behind us than there are in front of us?
Yeah. Well, Odyssey. I mean, the whole Odyssey concept. I mean, now they're recommending what, 10 or 11 speakers.
Ideally, Tom Holman would like I think a 10.2 system.
10.2, yes, yeah.
Right, wherein he puts actually 2 speakers outside of the main front, right, and left, called the wide or width speakers, and then 2 speakers up high on the wall in front, called the height speakers. Of course, there's no content that has those channels discretely encoded within it, so the Odyssey system simulates them, synthesizes them, and it's fun to experiment with that. Here we see a picture of the with the height speakers. They're supposed to be at plus or minus 45 degrees from the center and up 45 degrees from the floor. But that's getting a little beyond the basic. There are a number of receivers coming on the market now that have 9 channels of amplification in them. They have the Odyssey built in, and they have 9 channels, and you can use the extra 2 channels for height channels or for width channels, not both. Sometimes they provide outputs for both, but you need to provide an extra amplifier if you want to use all side width and height channels. Right, exactly.
So it can get to be, for a normal listening environment, it can be a little bit difficult to get all those speakers in your room.
Right.
And not
to mention the spouse acceptance factor.
Yes, see, it's a divorce generator.
Indeed. Okay, let's talk a minute about subwoofers, which were not in those diagrams. And there's all sorts of different approaches to that as well. I know you like to put your subs in the corner of your room typically.
I have many times in the past. Recently, I found a place that works a little better that's not in the corner.
Oh, where is it?
Right behind the center speaker. My center speaker, my left and right center speakers are quite far away from the wall behind them, the way my setup is. So there's room behind there to put a subwoofer. And it's sort of in the middle, and it just happened to work out well with at least one subwoofer I tried in there. So the only problem with it is that when you put a subwoofer in the corner, it tends to reinforce. In other words, it generates more sound. It reinforces the bass. Well, you don't want to turn it down so it's balanced properly, but that means the subwoofer is not working as hard. It doesn't have to work as hard. So
you're getting some amplification, acoustic amplification off the walls.
Right, and where if I have it midway between the wall behind the center channel, but and still another foot or foot and a half out from the wall behind it, the subwoofer itself, it's working harder. So occasionally I've heard a tendency for it to I can hear something that the subwoofer's not liking it. In other words, it's distorting a little bit, not very often.
Interesting, because I've generally followed Floyd Tool's advice. Which is what you have come to with that subwoofer, which is placing it on the at the halfway point on one of the walls, which he claims gives you fewer acoustic problems, than placing it in the corner. And by problems, I mean peaks and nulls.
That generally, I mean, that recommendation is useful for some rooms, but also it generally follows the Harman and the Tool research that's been done about using multiple subwoofers.
Correct. And if you have the option to use 2 subs, he recommends putting them on the halfway points of 2 walls that are that are right angles to each other. So one at the center of the front wall and one at the center of a side wall, to smooth out those peaks and valleys and give you a more smooth bass. And with 2 subwoofers, of course, they don't have to work as hard. Again, getting back to your previous point.
And it also I guess another one of the possible recommendations for 2 is diagonally opposite corners. I haven't tried that, and that's potential that it could work. And that would also you still get the corner reinforcement, but you might get more smoothing. So that's something that could also be tried if you have more than one subwoofer available.
Exactly.
But there's no hard and fast rule for setting up subwoofers. There's several recommendations, some of the ones we've just given. One of the problems with placing a subwoofer in the corner is, if I understand the the technology behind it properly. People recommend against it because it does tend to reinforce the bass. Obviously, as I said, you turn the control down to compensate, but basically, if you put a subwoofer in the corner, it's more likely to reinforce all the room modes than it is if it's somewhere along the wall or someplace. And if you have a very well proportioned room, so that the modes that it's reinforcing are very close together, so it tends to be smooth, and the corner can work very well. But if your room has modes that aren't very well distributed in the bass and you put it in the corner, then you're going to get lumpy sounding bass. And of course, another option is equalization. That's another whole issue too.
That is another whole issue that we're not going to get into today.
Yeah.
We do have a bunch of questions in the chat room, and I'm certainly going to get to as many as I can. The first one from Gordy Mac, can you describe how to do the subwoofer crawl? Oh
yeah, we're going to get that's one of the other techniques that I was talking that goes back quite a ways. It's based on reciprocity. The idea is if you sit, say, in your chair in somewhere in the middle of the room or wherever you normally sit, and your subwoofer is located in a particular place, if you move your subwoofer to where you are and put your ears where the subwoofer was, you'll get exactly the same result.
Yes.
So the idea is you put the subwoofer where your seat is, and that gets a little bit complicated because it doesn't just mean put it on the floor where your seat is, because the floor to ceiling distance has an effect too. The height of your ears. So you really need to put it at the height of your ears, which means you're going to have to put it on, a platform or something in the right place.
On your chair, yeah.
Well, or, if you don't want to ruin the upholstery, you'll have to build something to put it up on, whatever. But, especially if you got, a 150-pound subwoofer, it's kind of hard.
Exactly. It's going to be hard.
There are a lot of people have smaller ones.
Yeah, so the idea is to put it on your chair, on your seat, where you are.
Yep.
And then crawl around the periphery of the room, listening and playing something on it, of course.
Yeah, oh yeah. And you basically crawl around until you find the place where the bass seems least lumpy or least boomy, and that's where you should try to put your subwoofer.
Exactly.
Now, of course, one of the problems is there is really no optimum position for a subwoofer and a listener that will work for all listeners in any given room. It's just physically impossible. Okay.
Right.
I mean, Odyssey does have their EQ system does allow you it tends to normalize through a variety of different. You do your measurements at a variety of different listening positions, and it's supposed to produce a result that's reasonably good for all those for a wide area in the room, but not necessarily perfect for each one of those areas. Okay.
Right. It's a compromise, an average compromise that gives all the positions a reasonably good sound. But it doesn't actually give the best sound at any one position.
Right. Yeah. That can only really happen at any one position, which is a problem with small rooms. I mean, that's what we're stuck with in trying to reproduce sound. And what essentially is even the largest domestic space is a small room compared to a concert hall.
Yeah. Exactly right. I'm getting a couple of questions in the chat room about placing TVs in the corner of orienting your theater at a diagonal, essentially putting the display in the corner of the room and distributing out the speakers that way. Have you ever seen that work?
To do it properly, you need a pretty good sized room to figure out a place to put the surrounds where they'll work for the seating positions. So that can be an issue. Yes, I mean, I actually had that experience myself in a listening room, a 2-channel stereo in Santa Fe, where I found that the speakers sounded. I finally found a good place for them. Firing down the length of the room, but for a couple of months I was using them on the diagonal because the speakers were sounding too bass heavy any other place. So that if you go, and in fact you go into some rooms at CES, so some of the consumer electronics shows or the hi-fi shows, you'll show manufacturers had them set up on a diagonal, and they didn't do that. They didn't do that just because they thought it looked nice. They did that because they found it sounded better. So it can work, but it's much harder to do for a surround system than it is for a 2-channel.
Right.
Just because where do you put the surrounds?
Right, right, exactly.
One point before we forget, one point I'd like to bring out about just as a side note, since we're talking mostly about setting up audio gear, is that with today's flat panels tend to have fairly reflective screens, and you want to find a place in your room for your TV that'll work for both for your sound system and minimize reflections off of that screen. In other words, you don't want a lamp or a window in a position where when you sit, you're going to see that lamp or window reflecting on the screen.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And not only that, but on TVs with a very shiny screen, which include most or all plasmas, and some number of LCD
a lot
TVs
of
now.
LCDs today, yes.
Yeah, have a very shiny screen. Even if you don't have that lamp or the window or the TV placed such that those are directly visible, if you have ambient light in the room, you're going to see reflections of other things in the room, including yourself. Or furniture or other stuff if you've got ambient light in the room. So that is a very important point that I wanted to bring up here in terms of display placement ideas, which is if you have a shiny screen, which many flat panels now do, you have to be thinking about that, especially if you're going to have ambient light on in the room.
Yeah, you'll find that you're correct, and you'll get reflections off of other things, but the lights. But it may be impossible to actually get everything and eliminate all reflections. But as I said, make sure there's no bright reflection such as a lamp or a light or a window that's really going to create a real problem, real headache. Because most of the time, if you're watching the TV during the day, a lamp or a window will be annoying. But most of the stuff you're watching during the day is probably going to be fairly brightly lit material. So it's not going to be as much of a nuisance as, say, you're watching a movie at night.
Right. Or you're watching a movie like Star Wars or something where there's a lot of dark scenes, or The Matrix, that's got a lot of dark scenes in it, where those reflections will be a lot more visible and obvious. Yeah, but I know I had an experience for a very different reason when I first moved into Los Angeles 10 years ago. The first couple of reviews I was doing, I hadn't set up my projection screen yet, and basically I set up I didn't have a problem with reflections in my room because it's a blacked out room, but I basically set up the speakers first, with leaving enough space between them for where I knew where the best place for the speakers, where I knew I had enough room to put the screen. And then after the speakers were optimized, then I put the screen up. So that's
basically because once your screen is up, if you have a projection system, or if you have your TV and you're setting up your TV in your room, you're pretty much constrained as to where you can put those speakers.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
It's not a whole lot not like a 2-channel stereo where the screen dominates the setup. So you have to put your speakers where they'll support the screen, and you want to get the screen in the right place, but you want to now put it in a place where you're going to have a reasonable chance of putting your speakers in a decent location to the left and right and center of it.
Right. And then there's the issue of seating distance or viewing distance from the screen.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And there are a number of formulas that we use to calculate that. THX recommends a viewing angle of 30 degrees for a 16:9 high-def signal. SMPTE, I think, goes even a little wider than that. What's your general rule for seating distance compared to, say, screen height or screen width?
It's generally I generally am somewhere a little bit more than 1.5 times the screen width, I believe it is, but about 1.7 or 1.8. But there's no real hard and fast rule. I mean, some of SMPTE's requirements now, they're talking. SMPTE is of course now we got digital projection, but SMPTE was some of their original recommendations were made for film. And film has a higher resolution than video does, and you don't want to be sitting so close so you can start to see pixels or artifacts on the screen. It's not as much of a problem today with high def as, I mean, it was a real problem with standard definition. Most people sat like 15 feet away from their TVs with standard def, and that's another problem today. Is people with the high def, they tend to sit too far from their TVs. Exactly right, and they get less immersion than they could and should really. Yep. I mean, you can actually sit within 7 or 8 feet of a 50-inch high-def TV without seeing pixels. And the problem is, the closer you sit, the fewer optimum seats there are for people to sit. In other words, if you've got a TV that has reasonably good on-axis but not so good off-axis performance, and that's true of a lot of LCDs. If you're sitting 10 or 11 feet away from the screen, you can probably manage to get 3 people on a couch, and none of them will complain about the picture unless the ones on the left and right are video files. Okay. Right. but at any rate, but if you sit 6 feet away from the screen, which you could probably do and still not see problems with the screen, those people to the left or right are going to have a problem because they're sitting up there. They're farther off angle-wise than they were before. Right, and LCDs really often degrade their picture quality dramatically as you move off axis. Yeah. So I guess my bottom line is sit closer than you think might be comfortable for that TV. Buy the biggest TV you can afford, or you can reasonably fit in your room.
Yep.
Most people tend to buy too small a TV. I mean, they may all be able, if they can afford it, that's fine. If that's all they can afford, but don't necessarily, if you can afford a 50-inch or a 55-inch TV, don't necessarily say, oh, that's going to be too big. Okay.
Right.
It probably won't be.
It probably won't be. I agree with you entirely.
Yep.
One quick question from the chat room from iDoc Mark, who is asking about mounting flat panels over fireplaces, which I always discourage.
Highly unrecommended by all of us. That's
Right,
exactly. I know it's very popular. Interior decorators love it because it gets the TV out of the way.
Right.
You know, but you're going to wind up. It's very uncomfortable to watch. I find it very uncomfortable to watch a picture while looking up.
Right,
I don't like movie theaters. I don't like movie theaters that have screens that are too high.
Mm-hmm.
That used to be fairly common in multiplexes before they started putting in stadium seating. You know, they put the screen up so the lady with the big hair in front of you didn't block the screen.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So they put the
And now
screen
we
up
have
high.
studio seating. It's not so much of a problem, but at home, looking up, this iDoc Mark is actually an eye doctor, and there might be some eye strain there, but I've always thought that the biggest problem with that wasn't eye strain, but neck strain.
Neck strain, yeah. I guess one solution to that is to get some recliners.
Yeah, right.
You're planning and
And
you're
so
looking up at the picture.
I've also seen mounts that tilt the screen downward, but you're still having to look up. You're still having to
look
clean
up
your
at it.
neck.
Yep. Now the other issue is heat from the fireplace, and that shouldn't be a problem if you have the fireplace a while and the wall where you're going to mount the TV has never gotten hot, it shouldn't be a problem. On the other hand, if you've got heat, fireplaces tend to be very odd in the way they distribute their heat, depending on how they're designed. I mean, if the typical story is, you got a regular fireplace with an open front and all the heat goes up the flue and doesn't really. You get this nice warm feeling from a fire, but the heat's all going up the chimney.
Exactly right.
So basically, then there's not much heat coming out of the front of the fireplace. If you do what some people what they recommend now is have a glass screen in front, and that's supposed to radiate. There are ways to radiate the heat out into the room instead of
Back into the room. Yeah.
Well, if they're radiating out in the room, heat rises, so it's going to rise right in front of that TV.
That will be a problem.
That'll be a problem.
Right.
So it's putting a TV on top of above a fireplace to me is not a really good option. It's not a really good option if you're talking about home theater either. I guess you could mount in-wall speakers to the left and right. Where are you going to put the center in the fireplace? I mean, I don't understand.
Right. Exactly. There are just all sorts of reasons not to do it. So
Not to do that, yeah. But one other factor before we forget when we're talking about seating distance is don't forget if you've got floor standing speakers that have, say, 3 or 4 drivers in them, you might find that you can comfortably sit like 5 or 6 feet away from your TV, but your speakers aren't going to really gel all that well from that short a distance. You really want to be 8 or 9 feet away from the left and right speakers for them to speakers that have more than 2 drivers in them for them to basically for the sound to blend properly from all the drivers.
That's a very good point. And if you're going to sit 8 or 9 feet away, you'd better have a 55 or 60 or 65-inch display at least. Huh?
Have a big TV. Yeah, I'm not saying this is going to be a huge problem. It just means the speakers will probably not sound their best from 4 or 5 feet away.
Right, exactly. Let's go for a moment into connections. Obviously, these days, HDMI is the way to go, and it's very simple. You have, hopefully, an AV receiver or a preamp processor with separate power amps. That's in the higher end. And you have your various sources. You have, hopefully, a Blu-ray player, maybe a game console, maybe a cable or satellite box. You connect all those things to the AV receiver with HDMI, and then one HDMI cable out to the TV. Which is obviously, that's going to be the best way to go, right?
Well, it might be the best way to go. If you have a situation where you require different settings for different sources, say your cable box requires different brightness and contrast settings slightly than your Blu-ray player does, and I've seen that, where you get better results. We've discussed this recently about how difficult it is to properly set up a TV for cable or satellite because you don't have test patterns with them.
Right, exactly.
I mean, the HDNet, the station HDNet does broadcasts a few test patterns, like in 3 a.m. a couple days a week sometimes, or once a week.
A couple days a month, yeah.
A couple days a month, yeah. Not enough of them, but something better than nothing. But it is hard to properly set. I generally set up my TV to work with the Blu-ray player, and then if I find I need to fine tune it a little bit when I put a broadcast on, I do it. But because I know it might not be exactly right. But at any rate, when you set it up, when you need a different setting for your cable box or your Blu-ray player, you may not have that option going through a receiver and what input most TVs will allow different settings for each input.
Right,
but
exactly.
Most
you know what? That's a very good point.
Do not. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So that's an argument actually for taking each of your source devices and putting them directly into the TV. Mm-hmm. But then you have the problem of audio, because HDMI is carrying audio and video along the same cable. Yep. And the best quality audio, really, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. So if you take that directly to the TV, then you're not going to be sending it into the AVR. Yep. And so you're stuck either way. Now, a lot of AVRs have video processing in them.
Yes, and some of them have video adjustments, so I don't know for sure how many of them might have video adjustments that are separately adjustable for each input. That's a question I don't have an answer to right now. Some of them may. I mean, there's no reason why they shouldn't. That's probably all on a chip now. I mean, that's just like a TV has it. You can adjust them separately on a TV. Why couldn't you do it with a receiver?
Right, exactly.
But it might be something worth checking into. Obviously, probably most salesmen probably won't know.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's exactly right. Now, if somebody doesn't have HDMI, like an HDMI receiver or even HDMI on their TV, some people have older TVs, they haven't upgraded yet. Yep. I think the next best way to get video from your source components to the TV is with component video, correct?
That's the only way to get high def.
Only other way you're going to get high def, exactly right.
Yep.
And that involves 3 separate cables with RCA jacks on either side.
Right.
And so could potentially be a lot of cables running around. And then you have the issue of audio. And the only option there's 2 options, I think. One is to take digital audio out from the Blu-ray player cable box, and that would be in the form of coaxial digital audio or optical digital audio. But that's not going to send the new high-definition, high-resolution audio formats.
Nope.
So you're going to lose those.
Only get that through analog or through HDMI.
Exactly. And the analog option is 6 or 8, 5.1 or 7.1 analog audio outputs on a Blu-ray player.
Which is a mess, yes.
Which is a mess. It's 6 or 8 cables going into your AV receiver.
Plus,
so
there's another issue too involved there too. If you've got a receiver that, if it's real old, it probably doesn't have any kind of equalization or digital processing in it anyway. But if it's on the cusp, in other words, you bought it like 5 or 6 years ago, where it probably has some equalization, some digital processing, but it doesn't have HDMI. Most of the times when you pass through the analog stage of a receiver, on most receivers, and a few of them used to convert it to digital and to do the processing in digital and then reconvert it, but most of them don't have any of those features through the analog input, any of those audio features. You can't. I mean, basically you just have volume and volume channel levels usually and overall volume. That's about it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So there are compromises you have to make in any of these cases, and you just have to take a look at what you've got and do the best you can.
Well, the world is, like it or not, is going to HDMI or something or similar, and basically, if you have an upgrade list for the next thing to get, and you have most of what you need, like your TV and your speakers, a new receiver. If you don't have HDMI, a new receiver is probably a good idea.
Right. Let's see. Here we got a question in the chat room. What is the structural difference between component and composite cables?
You mean as far as the way the cables are made?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's no difference.
No, they're just three separate ones. I mean, the only difference might be by component cables, and the end of each one is labeled red, green, and blue.
Exactly, and a composite cable is color-coded yellow, and there's only one of them instead of 3 of them.
Yeah, they're both standard 75 ohm video cables.
Right, RCA connectors at the ends.
Yeah, except there's 3 of them per component.
Yeah, but composite will only carry standard def, and component will be able to carry high def.
Yeah, if you have 3 composite cables, and can keep them, labeled properly, you could use those for component. I mean, if they're three composite video cables, they should provide. I mean, there are differences in performance in analog video cables having to do with length and a lot of. I mean, there's some esoteric things we can get into, but basically they do differ. I mean, there is a difference when they get longer. Same problem with HDMI, except HDMI doesn't degrade slowly. It either works or it just usually goes away.
Virgil in the chat room asks, does placement of speakers and subs depend on the type of speaker?
Yeah, it depends. Not so much on the. Well, it's going to depend on subs. No, I'd say probably not. I mean, if you got a ported sub or I mean, how many different kinds of subs are there? There's a ported and sealed box. That's about it.
Right.
That shouldn't depend on the type. But for full range speakers, yeah, of course, if you're talking about bipolar or dipole speakers for the front channel, there are a few of those animals. You got electrostatic speakers and whatnot, some exotic high-end speakers. Position for those can differ dramatically from standard. But if you're talking about the kind of speakers you're normally going to put in a home theater, which is front radiator speakers, I'd say generally no, but it depends on a few minor factors. For instance, if you got small bookshelf type speakers, the worst place to put them is in a bookshelf.
It's true.
Yeah. Bookshelf
Why
speakers.
Is that?
It just basically is because of the environment that they're in. You basically put it in a bookshelf as you're putting it in a cavern. Okay. And that can cause all kinds of coloration. If you put them in a bookshelf too, mostly you got a two-way bookshelf. The temptation is always to put them on their sides because the shelves aren't that high.
Right.
Well, they don't work that well in there. They need to be. They're designed to be used with a tweeter above the woofer, not left and right. Tweeter to the left, because if you sit it, speakers have what they call interference effects between the two drivers. Those interference effects are more severe if the drivers are left and right than they are if they're up and down. Up and down only affects your seating height, but left and right can depends on where you're sitting in the room. So that's why a woofer center channel speaker is a poor compromise, because you get what's called combing effects. In other words, the response differs depending on where you sit, even if your ears are at the same height.
Right.
Whereas if you mount a bookshelf speaker vertically, the only difference you should have when you move off or on or off axis is there will be differences, but they won't be as severe. And of course, the biggest one being the high frequencies roll off as you get off axis on the tweeter.
Exactly.
But there will be difference on some speakers, regular speakers, if you sit at different heights, if your ear is at a different height. So, but basically, get back to the point at hand. When I talked about bookshelf speakers, the best place to put a bookshelf speaker is a foot or two from the wall on a good solid stand.
Right,
Okay.
and oriented vertically so that the drivers are one on top of the other rather than next to each other.
Next to each other, but that's one main difference. I mean, there can be differences in the response of a speaker, how it reflects from the floor and the ceiling, and depends on where the drivers are located. But that gets kind of esoteric, and I don't think the average listener has to worry usually about that. But basically, the biggie is things like don't put your bookshelf speakers on a bookshelf unless you absolutely have to.
Right.
If you have to put a bookshelf speaker on a bookshelf, try and get it vertically, and try and make sure that it's basically mounted so that it's not sitting back in the shelf. So basically, the front drivers are flush with the front of the shelf, and put stuff around it like books and stuff to its sides, so that basically as few cavities to the sides and around the speakers as possible.
Yeah, good point. Before we run out of time, I want to get a little bit into display setup because that's also really important, and a lot of people don't do anything about that. They bring a TV home, they take it out of the box, they turn it on, and they watch it like that. And the problem is that it's in what we in the trade jokingly call torch mode, which is absolutely as bright as possible because it has to compete on a showroom floor. But very few people I know live in a showroom.
Yeah.
So you can't really. It's not the best idea to be watching that TV in your home with that setup. So the first step I always say is go into the menu. There's an item called picture mode, sometimes just mode in the picture menu, and it'll be set to something like vivid or dynamic. And what you really want to pick is movie or cinema. Yeah. I would say one thing. A lot of new TVs are coming out of the box when you open up the setup. They do have a screen that says store and home.
Okay, they're starting to do that now. And you don't ignore that because it's probably set up for store or maybe set up. Well, it may or may not be, but you always want to select home. Don't ever select store.
Exactly, which will get you. That's a great place. That's exactly the right place to start. Particularly Energy Star Energy Star TVs. I believe have that opening screen now. The first time you plug it in and turn it on. So pick home.
Pick home, and then as you said, go to it'll be a movie or a cinema or something to that effect. Now you may find that obviously at that point you need to get yourself a good test disc of some kind.
Right, or what I call a setup disc.
Setup disc, yeah. I mean, there's a number of good ones. The Spears and Munsell is one we use a lot now. There's Joe Kane's discs, Digital Video Essentials, HD Basics. I mean, most of these are available in either in video stores or on Amazon for like $20-25, something like that. The price of a normal. They're not outrageously expensive, most of them.
Right, exactly.
And basically, they will walk you through. A lot of them will walk you through setting up your TV properly and getting the brightness and contrast. There are some setup patterns on some of the THX evaluated discs. I have heard, and I haven't confirmed, that they may not be quite as accurate in setting the black level as some of these other discs, but many of us have used them with reasonable success over the years. Certainly better than not doing anything at all.
Right, exactly. And that is the next step beyond just picking movie mode or cinema mode. We have some pictures, actually. I wanted to show some screenshots from some of these. Let's take a look, for example, at the Spears and Munsell screens. The one called Brightness, I think, is what I sent there. And that one, basically we have five controls that we want to look at in the picture menu of any TV. And they are called contrast, brightness, color, tint, and sharpness. And color can sometimes be called saturation or picture. I think
Sony calls it picture all the time.
Sony calls it picture all the time.
Yep.
And that's the color saturation.
Yeah, tint can be called U. Some people call tint U. HUE.
HUE, yeah, exactly. But the way you want to do this, I think, and correct me if you disagree. Well, don't correct me, but if you disagree, that's great. We'll talk about it. The first thing I set, let's put it that way, is the brightness control, which very counterintuitively establishes what's called the black level, or where the blackest part of the picture is displayed. And that's the first thing I said. And the second thing I said is what's called the contrast control, which specifies the white level. And I find that very counterintuitive. Why did they call these controls that?
Yeah, well, my experience. A lot of people most people that don't know have their TV set up wrong because they want a brighter picture, so they turn the brightness control up, and all they get is a washed out picture.
Right.
It seems brighter to them, but it has no punch or depth to it. It's just kind of blah.
Right. And that's the important thing to note here is setting the brightness control, which controls the black level. The lower the black level of a TV, up to a certain point, down to a certain point anyway, the more pop, the more punch the picture has. And if you raise that level up very high, it is all going to look washed out and not very pleasing. So that's probably, of all those 5 controls, wouldn't you say that's probably the most important one to set?
Brightness control, yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
That can make a huge difference in the way your TV is performs. And I would say that when you select movie mode, I found that on a lot of TVs, the movie mode is better than Vivid or some of the other Vivid, Sport, even Standard's usually pretty overdone. But the problem with movie mode on some manufacturers, they have a feel, they think that movies should be this kind of gauzy, fine grain kind of uninvolving picture. It tends to be a little bit flat looking. So that usually means that one of those controls is set wrong. Okay, don't assume that that any of those controls, standard controls, are accurate. They're set the way the engineers or the designers or the marketing people thought they should have them as defaults. Right, exactly. So, now, interestingly, color and tint controls these days in modern TVs, I think you found as well as I have, are pretty close in their factory settings. Yeah, tint is pretty close. I found that in some TVs, I tend to back off on the color. Maybe it's because I just don't like the vivid colors that a lot of manufacturers think we should have. Overly hyped colors. So I tend to back off. If anything, on color, I almost never go higher than the way where it's set in the factory. It's I usually drop it off a few notches sometimes, but a lot of times it's pretty close. You're right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and tint is usually pretty close. Tint, by the way, just by explanation, changes the overall color bias usually between. There's the tint. There's the tint. Setting pattern from the THX disc. And by the way, any THX certified DVD or Blu-ray will have a section in its menu called THX Optimizer, which has a series of displays, of screens that let you set these controls. And that picture we just saw is one that lets you set the tint control. And again, interestingly, the tint control is one that these days doesn't really need much tweaking. And the color control, which controls the saturation or the depth of the color, if you will, if you back that off all the way to 0, you're going to have a black and white image. You're going to have no color at all. And as you say, there's the color setup pattern. And here's another point: when you're setting these two controls, the tint and the color, normally what you do is you get, with these discs, come a blue filter, like a blue piece of cellophane, and you put that over your eyes. And when you do that, that color pattern that we just saw up there, which consists of white and blue letters, all the letters will look blue. Obviously, if you're looking through a blue filter, you're going to see nothing but blue. And then as you turn the color control up and down, the saturation or the look of that blue is going to look different on the white letters and on the blue letters, and you want to set that control so that they look the same.
The one problem I found, though, is that on some modern sets, that those color filters don't necessarily give you a really accurate result.
Exactly, particularly on LCDs.
On LCDs, there are some sets that have. There are a few LCDs and a few plasmas out now that have they have their own. They use various names for it, but they allow you to turn off all except one color. You can just play the blue part of the image, or the red part of the image, or the green part of the image, and you can use those, especially the blue, to help. That's a much more accurate way to set the color, and the tint is using those blue only. It may just be blue only, but they may offer you red only or green only too. But you can really only adjust with one. Most people can, so I go with blue and get that right.
Yeah, exactly.
But I found that in short of that, the best way to set color and tint, if you need to set it at all, is with a fairly natural looking image from a disc. You probably find the best. For instance, use flesh tones, because that's what we look at every day. If flesh tones are wrong, then the colors are all going to be wrong.
Exactly right. And we have a picture of some flesh tones, actually, or skin tones, again, from THX Optimizer, which is that's a great idea. If you don't have blue filters and you don't have a blue only mode, as you were describing in your TV, there's our flesh tone picture. If you adjust color and tint so that those flesh tones look natural, and we have some Caucasian people, we have some African American people, we have some Asian people in this picture, and ideally that's the kind of picture you want. If you get the flesh tones looking reasonably good, then the rest of the colors are going to look pretty good.
Right. Just make sure not if everybody looks like they just got out of 5 hours in the sun, then you know there's something wrong.
Yes. Exactly right. And then the sharpness control is the fifth one. I just want to touch on that really quickly. Generally, that's set too high. And we want to turn that down even to 0. In some cases, that softens the picture quite a bit, so maybe not entirely 0, but it's almost always going to be lower than what the factory sets.
Well, I have found sets where 50, where the middle is the correct setting, but more often than not, it's less than that. And generally, these test discs will have a pattern like you're just looking at right now, that have very straight lines.
Black lines
on a gray background.
And if the sharpness is set too high, what do you see?
You'll see white lines. If you look closely at some of the lines, especially the narrowest lines, you'll see basically white lines surrounding the black lines.
Almost like white halos.
White halos. You want to get rid of those. Turn it down as slow as you can, where you can't see the halos at all. And then basically don't go any lower than that, because you don't need to. But the halos are basically, that's what sharpness does. It basically adds white lines that, if the picture's small enough, you're sitting far enough away, it makes the picture look sharper, but it's really messing up the picture.
Right. Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, we only have a little bit of time left. One question from the chat room is, what kind of instruments and software do we use for video measurements and calibration?
For video measurements, we use a Minolta LS100 light meter, and
that's for measuring black level and white level.
Yep, and a CS200 colorimeter.
Right.
To measure the grayscale, the color temperature, and all those things that we report on. We also have a Photo Research 650, which is basically with my editor Shane Bettner up in Seattle right now. I use the Minolta most of the time, which is Scott's Minolta. And
believe me, those of you who are interested in maybe going out and buying one of those,
they're not
cheap.
No, these are cheap. There are less expensive tools you can use to do this sort of thing. None of them are really dirt cheap. There aren't any $50 colorimeters, but there are cheaper tools. And the tools we're talking about, the colorimeters are $12,000 roughly or more.
Exactly.
And even the light meter is about $3,000 last I checked. Or maybe more now.
So you have to be pretty serious about this if you really want to dig in there. Another question was, do you have to get into some super secret menu to do this? Well, for the calibration, the actual grayscale calibration, which is the final step of setting up a TV, yes, you do, and you need a lot of training, and you need this expensive equipment.
You need the expensive equipment and the training. You don't need to get if he's asking the person's asking if you need a secret handshake code to get into the adjustments. Generally, that's not true with most sets. Most sets
these days it's true. It used to be true.
Used to be true, and completely used to be true. But these days, most of the you get adjustments for the red, green, and blue are generally provided in the user menu, which you really don't want to even mess with those at all unless you have the right it'd be an endless exercise trying to get the picture you quote like. Those are really designed to be used with test tools, but they are there for those that have the tools. But in the olden days in CRTs, when they used to make you, they give you a code and you promise your firstborn, and basically they'd let you into the menu and adjust it if you were qualified.
Right.
But now everybody. The interesting thing is you can't before when you open a service menu, there are adjustments in service menus that will actually break the picture, break the set. It'll mess up the firmware in the set.
That's true. That's true.
You mess with the wrong things. So that's why they don't want people messing with the service menu. There should be nothing in the user menu, even those adjustments I'm talking about. If you don't have the right tools, you can't damage the set by using them. You just probably mess up the picture, but there's always a reset and you can go back.
Right, exactly. But really, the strong recommendation, I think, from both of us is don't go into what's called the white balance or grayscale calibration part of the
color management system, if they got something called
color management system.
Some sets have those.
Yeah, exactly. Don't go in and mess around with those without some training and the right tools, because you can really mess up the picture. You can't break the set, and as Tom says, and it's rightly so, there's always a reset button that'll go back to the factory defaults.
But this if we have one minute, one more thing I'd like to point out is on most sets have a lot of these tweaky adjustments, things like dynamic contrast, dynamic color, flesh tone. Most of those are on in are on in default in most of the modes that come out of the box. Most of the time, you want to turn those off. The only controls you really want to mess with, or to get the best you really need, are your brightness, contrast, color, tint, sharpness, and something called gamma, which is basically adjust the brightness of the midtones. And not all sets have a gamma setting, but a set with 2 or 3 gamma settings can be quite useful. That can increase make a set punchier too. If if it has 2 or 3 different settings, choose the one, and it might differ with different program material. But it is a control you might want to play with and see what it does for you.
Yeah, and that's one that you can experiment with.
Yes, yeah.
And while watching regular program material and seeing which one looks best to you.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. In the couple minutes we have left, I just want to basically, we only have time to touch upon audio setup, which is the other thing. Once you have things placed properly, once you have things connected reasonably, once you have the display set up, you also need to do an audio setup. And this, fortunately, is made very easy by automatic systems from Odyssey. Trinoff is another new one. Pioneer has its own. Yamaha has its own.
They almost all receivers have these things these days, automatic setup.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that I'm going to have to leave to the owner's manual for people to check out, because we have run out of time.
Yep.
Maybe we'll get onto this audio setup thing another time. But for now, I want to thank Tom Norton very much for being on the show. Thanks, man.
You're welcome.
Of course, you can check out Tom's writing at hometheatermag.com and in Home Theater Magazine, and also on ultimateavmag.com. Once in a while, he contributes a blog, which I always greatly appreciate. These are, of course, my online homes as well, ultimateavmag.com and hometheatermag.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv and follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Alan Kramer of SRS Labs to talk about a brand new audio technology, which I got a first sneak peek of just last week, and I'm very impressed. So I'm looking forward to talking with him about that. Until then, geek out.